Hello, my name is Kevin and I collect old irons. The topic of today's video is one of the minor groups in terms of the number of irons and the availability of these irons, but it is a group of particular interest to advanced collectors such as myself. We're talking about what I will call the rotary or the rotating irons. But before we go any further, we need to talk about the semantics. In the 19th century, these irons were called, either on the irons themselves or in the advertising literature, rotary or reversible irons. The idea for these irons was that these had an internal heat source, and that heats the inside, it heats the bottom. I use the bottom of my ironing, it cools down, it's now cooler, but the top is still hot. So I can rotate this, or reverse this, if you will, to bring the top to the bottom and continue that process. By the time this is cooled down, this is hot again, and I can keep using this iron for a considerable amount of time. If you look through the literature, many of the recent books on irons, these are sometimes called revolving irons. And that word is incorrect for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's not using a word that's period to these irons when they were in use themselves, but also it's a word that doesn't describe what these irons do. There's a big difference between rotate or rotating and revolving. And we can see that if we look at how these words are used in the cosmic affairs of the solar system. A planet rotates on its axis every 24 hours to produce a day. It revolves around the sun, which is a year. Two very different things. And what this iron does is it rotates on its axis, this being the axis. If you're going to talk about this being a revolving iron, then you need to be talking about what this whole iron is revolving around. So I use the word rotate as the title for this video, although I more commonly will use the word rotating in my general speaking of the group. This particular iron that we're looking at is one of maybe the oldest produced liquid fuel iron. It has a 1854 date. Actually, let's take a look at this more closely. Patented March 21st, 1854. Number 1, so there are multiple versions of this, presumably. And then, once I rotate this, it says the Rotary, notice the word Rotary here, Rotary Smoothing Iron Company in Boston. As many of you know, I am a teacher, and one of the courses I teach is an energy class. And at a point in time when we're talking about the history of energy sources, I actually bring this iron to my class, and I give them the information I just gave you. And then I ask them, what's the source of heat? And in the context of this iron, 1854, Boston, there is only one answer. This burned whale oil. And by the way, 1854, burning whale oil, this was a pretty ritzy iron in its day, used by only the most elite, most wealthy people. In the 1850s, whale oil cost $2.50 a gallon. That is $2.50 1850s dollars. A very considerable amount of money. I should tell you about this particular iron. The tank here is, I won't use the word reproduction because it's not exactly reproduced, but a new built tank has been added to complete the display. The original tank was made out of pewter. If this had the original tank, this iron would be worth maybe several $1,000s. Without the original tank, it's worth a whole lot less than that. But this is a very rare and very sought after iron. Our second iron, similar construction, is a little bit later. I think there was some stenciling here once upon a time, and I can dimly see some printing here, but I can't see the details. If anybody happens to have one of these with those details, please send me a picture or inform me on that, because I'm very curious. Otherwise, I have no information on terms of marking, except on the, on the lid of the tank, which has an 1859 and an 1872 patent date. 1859, 1872. So this is an iron used through the 1860s. Let's remind ourselves that the first producing oil well, actually dug rather than drilled, was 1859. That's another reason why I am very confident in saying that the previous iron was and used whale oil. This one likely used whale oil as well. Maybe if it was in the closer proximity to western Pennsylvania, it would have used crude oil, but it would use a fairly primitive liquid fuel source. Again, it rotates, and I will tell you this particular iron that I found late in an auction, and we'll talk in our next video about the process of buying irons. Bought it for $250. Got a very good deal for it. From there, we'll go on to a third iron. Let me go ahead and pull the tank off here. The inside of these things is generally very similar. You have an oil, or in this case maybe a kerosene, something like the wick of a kerosene lamp. I do not know the exact year for this iron. Get this back in. But I've seen some others. This one has no markings, but I've seen others that do have some markings, and they're in something like the 1870s. In the 1870s, we are probably talking about a kerosene, a somewhat more refined fuel. But we're not talking about gasoline. Gasoline, as we think of it, at least today, will be something of the maybe mid-1880s to 1890s, about the start of the very earliest automobiles. And from here, let's go to a third rotating iron. And you'll notice this one does not have a tank. It doesn't need a tank. The tank is in the handle. And this one has, and let me just read here, this is the Ellison Brothers, manufacturers, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Patent date 1890. And I am fairly confident that this one did burn gasoline. And a part of the reason for that is if you look at the lid here, the lid here is much smaller than the previous irons that we've seen, about 1 centimeter across. And again, gasoline is a less viscous fluid, and you can pour it more easily. The lids on these earlier irons, being larger, I think used a more viscous fluid. So this has the Ellison Brothers with the tank in the handle, and this is a fairly rare iron, and I paid a number of hundreds of dollars for this. Okay, so let's continue with these. Now, what we're talking about here is we're talking about a considerable group of irons with massive bases, generally having a similar general shape, well-built handles, but there's a variety of companies involved, and there is a variety of fuel sources. In this one, and this one has a patent 1876, and this one, if I pull the pin out here, this is a slug iron. I won't bother to try to take the slug out. It does have the slug. We'll close that down and pin that back in again. Oh, and this is a combination fluting iron. There's the top fluting plate. And by the way, these are irons I have considerable interest in. If anybody has the bottom plate associated with this, get in contact with me. Send me a picture. I would like to know what this looked like, and it might be, there are a fair number of these as presented here. As far as I know, no one has a bottom plate, and if we can find a bottom plate, then we might reproduce those make sure they're marked so people understand that they're reproductions, so that we can actually better show how these irons were used. So again, an 1876 rotating slug iron. And let me move on to one more. This one, and let me go ahead and do the rotation again. This one has a shield to it. This is a natural gas iron. There usually is a little piece here that I don't have. I actually will tell you, I found this one on eBay. It was in a set of a collection of irons, and in the back of the photo was this much sticking out from behind everything else. And I looked at that and I said, I think that's a rotating iron. And I got the whole collection for 40 bucks. So that was one of my major coups. And I like to tell these stories because these are the things that crank our juices sometimes. So, a natural gas iron. This iron probably was used, no formal dates, but I think in the latest 1890s to early 1900s. And what I mean to say here is we might remind ourselves that we started with an iron with an 1854 patent date. These things have something like a 50-year history with many companies involved. None of these are terribly common, some more common than others. This one, in this condition, maybe worth a couple of $100. In a little bit better condition, maybe $300 or $400 or more, perhaps. They can get pricier, and there are a couple of types that are very fancy and do have some serious money, and I have to admit that I don't have any of those. So these are these massively built, internally heated rotary or rotating irons. This is a combination fluter. It has, now you might be reminded that in the combination fluter talk we saw one of these that had a plate here from an 1873 patent. This is from another 1873 patent by John Hewitt. And what this has is it has rollers in the bottom, and these rollers can fit into the galvanized steel plate. And I thank Jerry Marcus for giving me this plate for this display. Thank you. The Hewitt rotating irons is probably the most common of the rotating irons, although again most of them just have a flat top and bottom. This particular permutation is rare and probably worth a couple $300, but the ones without the inset rollers can be had for well less than $100, maybe more like $200 if you have the upper plate and the bottom fluter plate. The Hewitt irons seem to have had their origin in this. This is the Man fluter, and it's called the Man fluter because of this patent drawing here. This is the original patent for this, 1872. It has a flat bottom and a fluting top. It does not have the back button that you push. You just have to physically turn it, and it's not an easy turn. But I think what happened here was that Man, very soon after the patent, applied or sold the patent to John Hewitt, and then John Hewitt marketed these in their various permutations and for a fair number of years. Again, the John Hewitt irons by and large are relatively abundant, and the most abundant of any of the irons that we're showing in this particular video. And that brings us to another rotating iron that goes to a manufacturer who has had a considerably long history with these, this being the Carver rotating slug iron. And to remind yourself, and we've seen these irons twice before, not the same irons. This particular version is called the Lady's Friend and manufactured in Wisconsin. And again, you have to get this thing just set just right, and you can pull the slug out. This particular one is a little more massive and a little more massive slug than the other two that we've seen previously. And again, it has two flat faces, and this one also has a fluter face, and I have the fluter bottom as well. So the Carver rotating iron values there in a couple hundred. And with that, I'd like to show you two more unusual rotating irons. This is a very unusual and rare iron. I know of only two of these in existence. There presumably are some others out there as well. This is an 1876 patent, and I owe some knowledge on this to J. Raymond and Dennis McDonald, who researched one of these in the Pressing News, and we'll talk about that resource in another video. 1876, and patented by a female inventor, Emily Cutter. Female inventors were fairly unusual in the 19th century, making up maybe 1% of all patents, and yet they're particularly prolific amongst the old irons, and we've talked about various of these inventresses, as they were called in that time. This is, and we do not have the bottom plate associated with it. The number of flutes vary, top and bottom, and to rotate it, you have to pull this out, and there we are. So that is the essence of this. Again, a very rare piece. How easily was it used? Again, I think it was a neat idea, and somebody was able to market a few of these, but I doubt if they were of a great value in practice. Again, their rarity would say so. And the last of the rotating irons that we're going to see here is a European iron, and given to me by a collector in Poland a year ago. And the age, this is the Prometheus, I should tell you, and Prometheus was a company that did natural gas products. They did the rocker gas jets, amongst other things that they did, and then later did some of the early electric irons in Europe. Quite an interesting company, and they had an interesting take on how to do things. So I have not practiced this ahead of time. We're just going to see if I can reproduce this again. There we are. Look at that. Did it on the first try. Can I do that again? Yes. So again, a natural gas heater heating the inside of this, and again able to rotate the bottom to get a fresh surface. This kind of idea I have not seen expressed in other European irons, although I must admit that I do not have a great deal of experience about the European irons. Very interesting, not overly uncommon, worth $100, $200 perhaps. And with that, I've said all that I have and shown all that I have of the rotating irons. They are a group I have considerable interest in, and I'm interested in learning more. And if you can share with me any of the irons or the knowledge that you have, I do plan to have addendum videos where we can add information and new irons into these lectures at a later time. So this is my favorite iron in the collection. I'm interested in the early evolution of the technology. This may well have been the first design for a liquid fuel iron in the United States. It is innovative, and it's just beautiful. And I've developed quite an interest in the rotating irons. There's not a whole lot of information about them. If you have an iron that you can send me pictures of or know some information about these, I'm curious to hear. If you have an iron that needs a new home, I can nominate myself perhaps as a place for that. And with all that said, thank you again for joining me as we walk through the various iron categories and their histories, and I look forward to seeing you again.